And welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to be continuing on with the Age of Enlightenment, and we're going to be covering the politics of the Age of Enlightenment, and particularly today we're going to be looking at something called the Glorious Revolution. It's an event in English history, and so our question is going to be, the Glorious Revolution saw the transfer of power, of political power in England to new groups and new classes in society. Which groups in society were these? And what type of political power did they acquire? All right, so grab a pen or a paper, or if you're a little more tech savvy, grab a computer and get ready to take some notes. So I'm going to start with a little bit of a review, some new stuff, but a review as well, of traditional English government. So England had, since the Middle Ages, been governed by a document called the Magna Carta. It was kind of like a constitution for the English. And this went way back to the year 1215, so right back into the Middle Ages. And basically what had happened is the power of the king in the Middle Ages had been on the increase. We've seen that before, right? Everywhere during the Middle Ages, kings were getting more powerful. And kings began to get so powerful that some of their leading nobles, in the case of England, some of the leading nobles, felt as if the king might become too powerful. He might become a tyrant. And so at a particular moment when the king wasn't doing well, it was a king by the name of John, King John. He was screwing up a lot, losing wars, and basically being a bad king. His nobles rose up against him, and they forced him to sign this document called the Magna Carta. Okay? And basically what this said was that the king was going to rule in accordance with law. Okay? So he wasn't going to act above the law anymore. And that he wasn't going to tax his subjects without consent, that you couldn't just take things from people because you needed them, even if you were the king. And this document, as I mentioned, would be the foundation of the English Constitution. Now the question became all right, so if you've got to ask your subjects before you take things, how are you going to do this? And so over the course of the next century, an institution called Parliament arose. Okay? And Parliament comes from the French word to parler, which, if you're like me and you know like 3 French words, that's one of them you know. It means to speak. And so it was a place where the king and his nobles could speak to each other. Okay? And so they would meet together, and Parliament would only meet when the king called them. And he would usually only call them when he needed money for a particular reason, extraordinary money. Not because he wanted to, buy a new jacket or something, but extraordinary cases like England was at war or something like this. And so the king would call the leading men of his realm together, and he would make his request, and they in turn would be allowed to speak as well. They could air their grievances or give the king counsel or whatever the case was. Now in time, especially as the medieval economy began to develop, as we know it did, the king began to realize, well, he was limiting himself by only appealing to the nobles. After all, there were many wealthy individuals now in England who weren't noble. And as far as the king saw it, would be a shame not to ask them for money as well. And so a new house was created. Okay, and by a house we mean a chamber, a place, a meeting room was created. And this would be the place where the common people, the non-nobles, would meet. And so England developed what's called a bicameral legislature. And that's a really fancy word for meaning a legislature, a lawmaking body with 2 different parts to it. In the United States, we have a bicameral legislature. The 2 parts of ours are the Senate and the House of Representatives. In England, it's the House of Lords, where the nobles continued to meet, and the House of Commons, where the non-nobles would meet. Now, included in this group were the high church officials. So like bishops and abbots and high-ranking churchmen would meet with the lords. Okay? And you probably remember that we saw this developing throughout Europe. So this wasn't just an English thing. There were assemblies in France, the Estates General, in Spain, the Cortes. There were different diets that would meet in Germany at this time. And so this wasn't a particularly unique thing. But over the course of time, it did become a unique thing. Because as the 17th century progressed, we saw that most countries in Europe entered what is called the Age of Absolutism. Okay? And this age is probably characterized best by our friend Louis XIV, who we spoke about a couple of lectures back. And essentially, under absolutism, in most countries, kings were able to dispense with their assemblies. After all, it was a bit of an annoyance to go and ask for money from the king's perspective, and people could say no, and you'd have to make promises, so it was much easier if you had the power to just do away with them. And so in most countries, kings did away with their assemblies and opted to rule on their own. This is part of what made them absolute. Now, in order to do this, oftentimes, kings would have to agree not to tax the nobles. After all, the nobles were powerful, so if you're going to exclude them from politics, then you would satisfy them by at least not taxing them. In England, though, England bucked this trend. We know that the nobles continued to pay taxes in England, and they also continued to meet in Parliament. Now, this wasn't because the English kings liked it that way. As a matter of fact, we're going to see that in the 17th century, as the trend was moving toward absolutism, some of the English kings attempted to impose absolutism on the English. And this was particularly the case with the new monarchy known as the Stuarts. Okay? So if you know your English history, you'll know in the 14 and 1500s, England was governed by a dynasty called the Tudors. And you would have Henry VIII and Queen Elizabeth I would be the most famous of the Tudors. Well, what happened was Queen Elizabeth, who was also known as the Virgin Queen, I won't really pry into her business. I'm not really sure she was a virgin or not, but it's besides the point. But it's relevant to our discussion because being, quote-unquote, the Virgin Queen, she never had offspring. And so when Queen Elizabeth died, the Tudor dynasty died with her. And a new dynasty, relatives to the Tudors, so it was Elizabeth's first cousin, a man by the name of James I, became the King of England. Now James, and this is in 1603, James came with his own ideas about how to govern. He was already the King of Scotland at this point. And he continued to be the King of Scotland, but he moved south and came to London. And in Scotland, James was accustomed to ruling as an absolute monarch. And after all, it was the trend everywhere else, and he didn't see why, as the monarch of the English now, he should have to deal with these old-fashioned institutions like Parliament. After all, it would be a lot more efficient if he could just tax the English as he saw fit and govern absolutely. And so James came with this idea of the divine right of kings, that he had been placed there by God, and so nobody really had the right to tell him otherwise. As a matter of fact, one of his first acts in coming to England was to lecture the Parliament. He said, quote, "There are no privileges and immunities which can stand against a divinely appointed king," end quote. So in other words, James is essentially claiming that that Magna Carta stuff and your parliamentary traditions are all well and nice, but I am the king and I will rule absolutely. And so, you know, this began to raise the hackles of some of the members of parliament and uh, many in the upper class because, who's this guy coming? It's like the new boss coming in and cleaning house on the first day. It's not a good opening. To further complicate matters, we know that in the 17th century, all across Europe, there was a lot of religious discord. So we talked about the religious wars in France. We talked about the religious wars of sorts in the Netherlands, and also the 30 Years' War in Germany. And so it was a time of a lot of turbulence. Well, it was no different than England. Now, England was solidly Protestant by this point, but they were Protestant of a particular sort. They were what is called Anglicans. You may remember when we talked about the Reformation that King Henry VIII had wanted a divorce from the Catholic Church, but was unable to obtain one. Because he was unable to obtain one, he eventually left the church. Now, Henry didn't really leave the church because he didn't like Catholicism. He left the church because he couldn't get the divorce. And so the new church that he created was essentially Catholicism with just himself as the Pope. And so England in a lot of ways was Protestant, but there were a lot of aspects to it. If you walked into an Anglican church, you wouldn't be able to tell if you were in an Anglican one or, a Catholic church or a Protestant church. It retained much of the Catholicism. And so this tradition had continued on in England. The bishops had just, sworn allegiance to the crown rather than to the Pope now. It was essentially the same church. However, there were many subjects within England who thought that the Church of England was still too Catholic for their own liking. And these individuals wanted to purify the Church of England. Okay, they wanted to purify it in the sense of removing Catholic elements and to make it something closer to what John Calvin had instituted in Geneva. Now, these individuals who wanted to purify the Catholic Church became known as Puritans. Okay? And they especially didn't like the idea of bishops. These Puritans, for the most part, believed that each congregation should choose its own religious leaders. After all, many of the bishops were just noblemen who had been appointed by the crown. And many of these noblemen didn't take their job very seriously. They were just there because, well, they needed the job. For these Puritans who were very serious about their faith, this was wrong. And they wanted to go back to what they believed was more of a biblical sources, where the early congregations, as they saw it, chose their own leaders. All right. Well, James would hear none of this. After all, he was the king, and he was the one who had gotten to appoint these bishops. And the way he saw it is he kind of liked it that way. And besides, if people started to choose their own bishops and their own religious leaders, well, that was only really one step away from democracy. The next thing they were going to ask is to start appointing their own, political leaders. And so James said absolutely not. All right. And so James and the Puritans got locked into this dispute. Dispute over how Catholic the church was going to be, or how Anglican the church was going to be, I guess I should say, and how, what the religious policy was going to be. And so this was and James came down pretty hard on these Puritans. Many of them decided that life in England was too difficult, and so they went off to the far corners of the earth, far away from England as they could possibly find, namely to Massachusetts and to New England, where they founded Plymouth Colony and Boston. So there's a local connection here with all of this. And after all, James begins his reign in 1603, and the first Puritan colonists come here in the 1620s, just when this is getting hot. All right, well, James has a pretty unhappy relationship with Parliament, but it would be nothing compared to his son. When James died, I think in 1624, Charles, his son, became the new king of England. And Parliament, having experienced the situation with his father, let the new king know, in no uncertain terms, that they had certain demands that he was going to need to abide by. His father had found ways to tax his subjects without their consent, and the new parliament said, no, here in England, you have to ask us if you're going to tax us. The king had also had a bad habit of arresting his political enemies, and Parliament said there's not going to be any more of that. You need to have an arrest warrant signed by an independent judge. You can't just make people disappear. Another issue was the quartering of soldiers. James had not respected people's property rights the way they thought they should, and he had insisted that they take in soldiers into their homes without paying them. And they refused to give they refused to give Charles any money. They weren't going to vote him a single dime until he agreed to all of this. And so this was a real challenge to Charles. Charles took this pretty personally. And since he had the right to call a parliament, kings could call parliaments or not call parliaments, he said, you know what, you guys can go home, and I'm not going to call you anymore. And so he sent the parliament home in 1629 and didn't call him again for a really long time. Now, during this time, he found ways to raise revenue, kind of what Parliament would consider illegal ways, but he managed to live without Parliament. And so for a while, it seemed that the Stuarts were on their way to becoming absolute. After all, if you don't call a Parliament and you find ways to live on your own as a king, then, well, you can eventually perhaps make this a permanent situation. And it would have possibly remained a permanent situation, except something extraordinary happened. And that was war. Now, initially, war broke out as a result of the Scots. So Scotland, if you're familiar with your geography of the British Isles, is the country to the north of England. And Charles, like his father, was he was the king of Scotland as well as England. Well, anyways, the Scots, like their brethren to the south, tended to have a Puritan streak to them. They also agreed with the English Puritans that the Anglican Church was too Catholic. And when Charles tried to impose English Anglicanism on them, the Scots rose up in rebellion. And Charles soon had the problem of a Scottish army marching into England and wanting to have a word with him. Well, he was going to need some soldiers if he was going to stop these marauding Scots. And so, to get these soldiers, he was going to have to call a parliament. Now, the problem is he hadn't called a parliament in 11 years. It was now 1640, and he had left on bad terms. And Parliament hadn't forgotten anything. Rather, they were angrier than ever. It was kind of like with a hose, right? If you stop off the water to a hose, it doesn't come out for a while, but when you do unleash it, it comes out with even greater force than it would have, and that's what happened. And so Charles desperately needs money. He desperately needs troops, and only Parliament can give him that. And so Parliament, before they were going to give him anything, read him the Riot Act. That his taxes were illegal. The royal courts, which he continued to use, those were illegal. And Parliament even insisted that some of his closest advisors be executed for giving him this bad advice of not calling Parliament. Well, all of this was too much for Charles. Even in his vulnerable situation, he wasn't going to sit here and be lectured. And so things got really, really bad. And eventually, war broke out between Charles and not only the Scots now, but Charles and Parliament. And this event is known as the English Civil War. All right. Now, in a lot of ways, where you fell down on this side of the Civil War said a lot about what your position in society was. Charles had the solid support of the Anglican bishops. That makes sense, right? He was their defender. Charles was an advocate of Anglicanism, so naturally the bishops would support him. Charles also had the support of the aristocracy. The great barons and nobles of England tended to support Charles. Charles had the support of the north of England for the most part, which was much more rural and old-fashioned in many ways. But Parliament had the support of the growing mercantile community, the merchants, and many of the gentry. So essentially, Parliament had the support of the House of Commons. And we know from our last lecture that the money of the gentry and the money of the merchants was increasingly a force in English politics. The feudal lords that Charles had supporting him really didn't have anywhere near as much money as these non-noble gentry, and also the merchant community that was centered around London. And so the Parliament tended to be stronger in the southern parts and in the commercial parts. Well, this was a huge advantage for Parliament because Parliament would need to raise money and would need to raise troops, and they had ready access to money through many of these wealthy merchants and many of these wealthy gentrymen. Furthermore, Parliament could count on the religious devotion of the Puritans. As a matter of fact, Puritans would make up the backbone of the parliamentary army. Well, the deck was really stacked against poor King Charles. With the superior money, the support of the House of Commons, the Puritans, Parliament was able to defeat Charles. And increasingly, Parliament was dominated by a figure by the name of Oliver Cromwell. Oliver Cromwell was a Puritan, but turned out to be a great military genius. And under Cromwell's leadership, they were finally able to not only vanquish Charles, but Cromwell eventually had Charles beheaded for treason. And so this was a very radical act to take. Nobody had really ever chopped off a king's head before. And so this was a pretty drastic action that Cromwell and the Puritans took. Well, the question became, with King Charles dead and his own children fleeing abroad, and the lords and the bishops defeated now, what was going to come next? Well, England essentially became a republic. A republic is a form of government without a king. Okay? And usually you have elected representatives. And so really all that was left without Charles was just Cromwell, his army, and what was left of Parliament. And so this new government, led by Cromwell, abolished the House of Lords. So we don't need lords anymore. They were on the wrong side. They abolished the Anglican Church. And so Puritanism became the dominant religion in England at this time. Well, under the Republic, things got pretty out of hand pretty quickly. It was one thing for the gentry and the merchants to abolish the lords and the king, but what they soon found was that the people below them now, members of the army and the peasantry and the and regular workers, were anxious to continue this reform. Okay? And so many of these people had very radical ideas. And so there were groups called levelers, for instance, who wanted to level the playing field. And they advocated universal male suffrage, which is a fancy word for saying they thought that all men in England should have the right to vote. Because up until this time, it was really only wealthy individuals with substantial property that could vote. Well, the House of Commons didn't really like this very much. It was true that they didn't want the lords in power or the king anymore, but they didn't really want a situation where there was going to be anything like democracy for sure. But it was even worse because some groups were even more radical, like the Diggers. The Diggers argued, well, since we've gotten rid of the bishops and we've gotten rid of the lords, we've created equality of sorts, why don't we go all the way and make everybody equal? And so the Diggers essentially advocated a type of communism. Redistribute all the land and make everybody equal. Well, this really scared members of the House of Commons. Furthermore, there were many religious radicals that emerged during this time. It was the time of the Republic was remembered as a chaotic time, especially for the gentry and the merchant community. There seemed to be a lot of crazies coming out of the woodwork, as they would have seen it. Well, only Cromwell was strong enough to keep all of these groups in check. And so eventually, Cromwell became a type of military dictator over England, abolishing Parliament itself. Cromwell was able to rule England for about 10 years. But then in 1658, he died. And there was really nobody in his close inner circle that was capable of holding England together. And so for many members of the gentry and merchant community, they faced the prospect on the one hand of communism or radical political philosophies on the one hand, or sucking it up and asking the Stuarts to come back. And so given the choice, they invited the Stuarts back. And this period is known as the Restoration, because Charles's son, Charles II, was offered the throne in 1662. And essentially, things were restored back to the way they were. So the House of Lords was reestablished, Parliament was recalled, the bishops, the Anglican bishops came back, the Puritan churches that had sprung up were suppressed. But the Commons didn't give back all of its power. It kept some of its new powers. And for the most part, Charles agreed to this. Charles had spent most of his life, bouncing around from one European to the country to the other, and he was just happy to be king, and so he agreed to most of this. Now, one of the things that Parliament really insisted on, though, was that now that the Anglican Church was back, that was fine, but that Puritans and Catholics should not be allowed to hold government. All right? The idea was that they're subversive. Puritans, we've seen what happens when the Puritans took over. It wasn't very good. Nor do we want Catholics to come over. And so the law became that in order to hold office, you could not be a Catholic or a Puritan. Okay? Only Anglicans could hold office. And Charles was okay with this. Didn't really care very much. And Charles enjoyed himself as king, took many, many mistresses, and lived it up. And the restoration of Charles remembered as generally a pretty happy time. Things went back to normal. The Puritans were gone. You could get drunk again and dance and party and all the things that Puritans had outlawed. Go to the theater again. All this was brought back, and Charles didn't really have too much of an axe to grind against anybody. Well, even though Charles took many mistresses and had many children, unfortunately, none of these children were legitimate. In other words, none of them were by his wife. And so they could not inherit the throne. And so the throne, on his death, went to his younger brother, James II. And I apologize in advance for all the Charleses and the Jameses. The Stuarts weren't known for their authenticity and name selection. So this is James II, the brother of Charles II. And James II, like his brother, had spent a lot of time in France as a youth while Cromwell was in power. And during this time, he had come under the patronage of Louis XIV. In other words, Louis XIV gave him money and continued to fund him kind of as a client once he became the King of England. In addition to that, while in France, James had become a Catholic. And so, James came into power already kind of illegally, in a sense. I mean, Catholics weren't supposed to hold any sort of office, never mind the office of the king. And unlike Charles, who was pretty laid back, James wasn't. He let everybody know that he was a Catholic, and he even appointed Catholics to positions of high power. In addition to that, James, like his father, came to the throne with ideas of absolutism and ideas of the divine right of kings. Well, all of this grated his subjects. And James began to alienate some of his closest supporters through his open Catholicism and some of his political ideas. And pretty soon, people began to talk about removing James. But here's the problem. The English upper class had seen what happened the last time they had removed the king. Well, what happened was it seemed like all of society had broken down under the Republic, and so they didn't want to go back to that. They wanted to keep their power, the English upper class did, and we mean the gentry and the merchants. They wanted to keep their power, but what they didn't want to do is they didn't want to have an absolute monarch. And so they went monarch shopping. They began to reach out to a man by the name of William, Prince of the Netherlands, who was distantly related through marriage to the Stuarts. Now, William was a Protestant, and the English upper class invited William and his wife Mary, who was brother to James and Charles, to come to England to invade it. This might be the first time in history that any country volunteered to be invaded, but this is essentially what happened. And so William came over in 1688 with Mary, and this event became known as the Glorious Revolution. Why was it so glorious? Well, it was glorious from the perspective of the English upper class, the gentry and the merchants, because hardly anybody got killed during the whole thing. James realized that nobody really supported him, and so he abdicated the throne. He left England for the continent. And William and his wife Mary became the new king and queen of England. All right? And so this was glorious because, well, in a lot of ways, William and Mary were now beholden to the English upper class. All right? Now, before William and Mary could even take the reins of government, the Parliament wanted to make sure that they understood exactly where their power came from, namely from them. Parliament had selected this king. And so they made William and Mary sign what is known as the English Bill of Rights of 1689. And this supplemented the Magna Carta by explicitly stating all the things that Parliament thought that the king should do. All right? So it outlined in great detail that only Parliament had the right to make laws. Kings could veto a law, but only Parliament could make the law. Furthermore, Parliament would retain the right of taxation. No king could tax his subjects. Parliament would tax the subjects, and they would give the king an allowance to live off of. All right, this became known as controlling the purse strings. Furthermore, Parliament was still afraid that William might try to, at some point in the future, or one of his successors, raise an army like Charles had tried to do, and suppress Parliament. And so Parliament made it a point in the Bill of Rights that only Parliament could call an army. All right, and so they felt this put a lot of the powers of a sovereign state that we talked about before into the hands of Parliament, right? So the lawmaking ability was now in the hands of Parliament. Taxing ability would be in the hands of Parliament. Army would be in the hands of Parliament. The English Bill of Rights also laid out the civil liberties that the English would now enjoy, namely the freedom of speech. Okay, so the Stuarts had tried to suppress speech at various times, and Parliament wrote it into the Bill of Rights that people should have a right to criticize their government. They should have the right to a free press. They should have the right to bear arms. They felt that one of the best remedies against an absolutist king would be a well-armed population. Trial by jury was officially recognized. All right. Later, Parliament also included religious toleration. Even though religious minorities wouldn't be allowed to hold office, they would at least be allowed to practice their faith unmolested for the most part. All right. And in this way, Parliament was able to cool a lot of the religious fury that had torn apart the continent up until this point. Now, it's significant to remember, because this all sounds a lot like a democracy, that England was pretty far from a democracy. All right? And that's because the franchise was only extended to a very small percentage of the population. Now, when you hear the word franchise, you're probably thinking of McDonald's or something, and we don't mean the franchise in that sense. When we talk about franchise in political terms, what we mean is the right to vote. Who had the right to vote? And in 18th century England, the only people that would have the right to vote would be substantial property owners. All right, so it's true that Parliament would represent the people, but the people here was defined by having substantial sums of money. All right, and so in many places this meant the gentry. In other places it meant only a certain section of the citizenry. All right, and in some places it meant that seats to Parliament would be controlled by one person. Okay, and so the franchise was far from a democracy. And that's including the fact, obviously, that that no woman could vote. But even among men, only a very small percentage of the very wealthy had the right to vote. Okay, and so I want you to think, who is essentially in power now? We've seen that during the Glorious Revolution, there's a big transfer of power to new groups and to new classes in society. And between this and the English Civil War, which groups in society benefited the most from this? And what types of political power did these groups acquire?